I think for us it's time to introduce Victor Shepelev. He's going to have a talk about the documentation of Ruby itself. And the word struggle in there, well, that doesn't sound good. Anyway, Victor, he's a Ukrainian developer. Sorry, he calls himself a programmer and poet. So he's a programmer and poet with 12 years of experience and 15 years of Ruby programming. So it's 12 years of experience with poetry and 15 of in development. I don't know. Probably you can answer that later. Then he is working at the moment at Verbit.ai, and he's also mentoring students for the Google Summer of Code, and he's mentoring in other projects, and he's a developer of open source software. Victor.
Hi.
Is that 12 years of experience as a poet and 15 years developing Ruby?
Well, it's 12 years of programming. It was C++ before Ruby. And as a poet, it's probably more like 37, because I'm 37 old years old. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'd like to start with your presentation. Tell us about the struggle for the documentation of Ruby itself.
Okay, let's start. I'm here to tell you about the documentation of the Ruby itself. As was already told, but I'll reiterate because some of it is important. I am developing in Ruby for like really long time. I really in love with Ruby, and I wanted to stay my main language for the next years. And I am also mentoring students in Ruby for maybe last 5 years, and that's when I started to notice that things in our documentation might be better, and started to doing something about docs, about the language itself. So you might recognize me as the guy who invented the kernel then method, which is like splitted the community, and some other nice things in latest versions of Ruby. I also added a lot of docs in recent versions. And I maintain the Ruby reference site, which I'll talk a bit through the course of this talk, and even was recognized for this effort by Fukuoka Ruby Award, which I honestly quite proud of. Let's ask ourselves this question: how's our docs like? I mean, not the tutorial blog posts or books, which we know they are quite cool. There are a lot of good authors. There are a lot of helpful people on the internet, but like the base language docs. To dive into this question, I urge you to ask yourself some like random sample questions, which all of them are from my mentoring experience. This is questions which students ask quite oftenly, and trying to answer them, I sometimes stumble onto the fact that even some basic questions about Ruby is not easy to find in our documentation. Like if you go into the question of file read, which is in every tutorial and every code piece, you will not find the method description, because it's actually IO read, which file is inherited from, and for novices it's like struggling point, and there are much more, like what are blocks and where to find documentation for them in the base language documentation, what are our code documentation conventions and how it's typically done, and what good things in our standard library. It is not that easy to find. If we'll try to find the answers for some of those like quite basic questions, we'll stumble upon this. That's a section of official Ruby site regarding the documentation. It links to some quite good and adored materials like Wise Poignant Guide to Ruby is probably what all of us, all the Rubyists, started with. Like there are some koans, Ruby Monk, some good tutorials, but it is not that helpful when you start today. Because on the part of the reference documentation, again, on the same official site, you'll find like quite a lot of links to several, again, good and helpful sites, which are though confusing for the newcomers. For example, if you go to for the first link in the Ruby language official site, to the link to official API documentation, you'll see this. That's like docs.rubylang.org. That's where everything is, and I ask you to look at the left section of this, where like the basics of language is described. It's not some structured table of contents. It's just the default rendering of all the files in docs folders in like alphabetical order. And if you start to learn Ruby from this, you'll be confused. And of course, we understand that a lot of people start with tutorials, start with books, but for the base experience, the experience to return to the main documentation for the language, for experience of programmers of other languages who tries to switch to Ruby or just look at it and what's interesting there, it's not that helpful. If you look further in this table of contents on official docs site, you'll see like all the classes from core classes, standard library classes, everything just in alphabetical order, and it is confusing. It is confusing not just because there is a lot of this stuff, but because the stuff is organized in a manner of like the default programmer's manner, just alphabetical order of everything. We have several different renderings of this core documentation, like rubydoc.org and so on and so on. They are competing in Google when you Google something, and some of them are rendered better, some of them are rendered in more modern styles, but in my experience, neither of them provides the like reference experience, the experience of give me the whole picture. And another huge problem which can be found in our documentation, especially when you are mentoring students or when you are helping less experienced colleagues, that some of the very core things in the language, they are documented sparsely. Of course, it's understandable because language is evolving, because a lot of people work on it, because stuff changes frequently and a lot. And to be honest, this example of the prots, one of the main concepts in Ruby documentation and how sparse it is related to version 2.5, and since then it became better for a few versions. Then it became like over documented. If you'll go to the master's version prots documentation, you'll see something which looks like a book about prots, like spanning several long screens with all the details, where again for newcomer or for switcher from another language, it's hard to find the like the essence, the core of this experience. So to sum it up, what is problematic in our current language docs? The depth, it's really varying. Even for some of the core classes, the docs currently is very sparse. For some of them, they were absent as recently as for previous versions, and it was recently fixed by work on of few dedicated people. And some of those docs are vice versa some of those classes and methods are over documented. Some of those classes are hard to discover because if you'll go, for example, to the standard library documentation, it would be a large mix-up of libraries that are convenient for everyday life, like, I don't know, pass name or JSON and so on, and for libraries that are suiting very particular purpose. Some of them are outdated. Then there are such a huge massive of docs that some aspects became contradicting each other. If you'll try to go through the file docs and then temp file docs and try to understand all the options with which you can read or write files or temp files and so on, you'll most likely be lost. And the last but not least and very important problem is the actuality on documentation. As my hobby project, I am working on an annotated list of all the changes in recent Ruby versions. I started the work at version 2.6, then I covered 2.7 and went back to 2.4 and 2.3. And documenting the changes in each version, even as old as 2.3, it's like 5 years. I found stuff that was in the changelog, which is good useful things, but which are not in current documentation. People are trying to fix it. Some of it is already fixed. Some of it is discussed how to fix, and so on. In general, our docs like they deserve more love. When I started to learn Ruby, like almost 20 years ago, the go-to thing was the Programming Ruby book by pragmatic programmers. It was really awesome as a documentation and explanation for the like whole language. It started with really simple stuff and went all the way to reference to entire language and reference to entire library, and it was like super helpful. It was my go-to PDF for several years. Unfortunately, the book haven't been updated for the next version, so the most recently available one, it is like for 1.9 plus some things from 2.0, and since then Ruby changed significantly, and the preferred community style changed significantly, and now we have a lot of books that are helpful to different aspects, but we seem to not have a good overall reference. Can it be better? When well, we can look at our like friends, our competitors. If you'll go to Python's docs, you'll see at the documentation side the helpful list of very actual links to documents to current versions. And if you go through the reference link, you'll see like the structured reference for all the language aspects, starting from like simple exams and going all the way through the library. If you'll go to Rust site, you'll see the same. If you'll go to Elixir site, if you'll go to PHP site, most of the languages in existence, I'll just stop here, but there were more slides with other languages. What can be done? What is, let's say, humanly possible to do? So what we want is the reference, the thing that covers not some interesting aspects, not like what is the documentation for this particular class I am working with currently, but the whole picture. And this whole picture that can be read like can be read from top to bottom or accessed where you can easily find the parts you are interested in. And at this point, we still don't have at least official reference for the Ruby language, and not only language and the library, but also deeper aspects like how do you embed the Ruby in other program, how do you write an extension, and so on. But we know that we have like a great community. We know that people are super helpful on Reddit, on Twitter, on official mail list. When I was started, I was like really fascinated when I wrote to Ruby Talk mailing list, maybe like third week my studying of Ruby with, as I now understand, very dumb question and in very bad English, even worse than it is now. And I received the answer from Mats himself. He was not like too lazy or too looking from the top of the hill. He just answered, no, it works this way and that way. You can try this, and it would work. But the existence of the reference, it is important because it creates the programming languages image, not in public relations sense, though in public relations sense too, but more in a sense of how we perceive the language, how the newcomer starting to work with language perceives it, like whether they perceive it like something they can just read a book about and understand the how things are related, or they are picking up like this trick, that trick. Did you know blog posts and some random answers on Stack Overflow, and they became kind of proficient in the language, but still sometimes falling into a deep pits of, I don't know, differences between prots and lambdas, or how do you efficiently work with enumerators, and so on and so on. But it's not only a newcomer problem. It's a problem for pragmatic people who start to work grasp the basics, then start to work with real hard problem, and they're super smart and they're super pragmatic, and they know what they know about the language, and allow themselves to ignore the rest. But still those like pits, deep pits in understanding, those huge gaps, they are harmful for their work. Again, we know that most of the people nowadays come to Ruby to work with Rails, and we know that Rails have awesome documentation and some awesome books, but this creates some community which knows, let's say, Rails as a like quasi language better than Ruby itself. It's not like a bad thing. It's not like I'm saying they are, I don't know, dumb or not professional or something, but it's just harmful for their productivity, and Ruby is a language that is helpful for productivity. When people from other languages come to look at what interesting things that those Rubists have, they are like, but where do I read about those things? This blog post, like it was cool. This I don't know, trick on hacker that I saw on Hacker News, it was cool, but how it is related to the whole Ruby situation? And it leads to discrepancy between how we perceive Ruby. Because we know that it's one of the most consistent languages that I worked with. Let's say this to not be too global. It has like small core of really well designed features which provide a lot of expressiveness, but when you study such a language without super good reference, just by books, even good books and blog posts, sometimes you find yourself in a situation when you know that some things work and you even know how they work, but you don't understand why, and you maybe not can't see how some things that feel like very different, they're quite similar, and they all coming from the very small and consistent core. So we know that in the bigger community we are frequently perceived as people who are working with some quite esoteric things that are like cool and magical about this thing, but we'll better stick to another things which are not that magical. I am not saying that this situation, which is quite sad for me personally, that it's only due to lack of good dogs, but I believe that this fact it contributes a lot. So, can we do it better? Obviously we can. Because we have a nice community. We want our language to prosper. We love it. We are proficient with it. We are proficient with explaining things. We are proficient with understanding what we don't understand and explaining it to each other. And when saying we here, I am not meaning like all dinosaurs like me who wrote in Ruby for like 15 years, we are so proficient, we'll help you. I am meaning the whole Ruby community, because it's so supportive, it's so helpful to each other, that the Ruby community as a whole, it's it's a powerful thing that can do better. So what exactly can be done? I understand that writing something about something in personal blog or at your company's blog, it is maybe more helpful for your personal image, more helpful for your personal relation with the world, but sometimes finding stuff that is not as good explained in official docs, which is not as good understood by newcomers or our colleagues, it is good to just stop right then and there, and at least think about how we can better describe this stuff to each other and to others. It is the most it is a bit harder than write just a blog posts, but make a standalone description as a small site, maybe just some GitHub pages, maybe some open repository with some markdown documentation. It's like a really good thing and really easy thing to do. A bit harder, but still pretty accessible to any of us, is expanding currently existing docs. It's just a small pull request to Ruby main repository, and the maintainers, they are very acceptive to pull request, expanding documentation, and I saw a lot of people doing just their small part, just like maybe fix syntax of one outdated example, and you'll make the life of everybody around you slightly better. Another thing that is probably harder to do, but still I'd like to see people doing it, is we have a lot of docs already existing, but as I shown, and you can see by yourself going to official documentation sites, it can be just done better, meaning the stuff more discoverable, for having the stuff like more readable, just for having the stuff to look more modern, so people coming to our documentation would not be like taken aback by, oh, this documentation was written 10 years ago, probably it's all outdated and not interesting. And the last but not least, I believe that the whole problem of the language documentation in general, language basics, language reference, it can and should be handled by the community, but like it's not easy. Why it's not easy to handle the documentation as a whole? Because to be honest, this work is not as thankful, as rewarding as even contributing to language with like new code, new methods, new ideas, and so on. Because by the very nature of documentation, those who see it now in the current state, they appreciate it as it is. If you enhance it, if you work on it, and the next version will be documented better, well, it would be appreciated as it is. It's hard to find the point when everybody says, okay, this new cool documentation is like new and cool. But I believe that just making things better is somehow a reward on itself. And the last big problem is probably this effort requires some, I don't know, working groups, some guidelines, and so on. Currently, it works the way that somebody contributes docs, and if they are readable, if they are better than before, they are merged. It sometimes it leads that to fact that docs for different classes and methods, they are written in really different styles with different levels of detalization and so on. And the core features documentation, it's hard to contribute to without always returning to the whole picture. I tried to do something about it myself. There is a thing that I'm calling the Ruby reference. Obviously, it is not the reference in the meaning that it's not official, but at least it is a reference that exists now on the internet and looks more or less like as a reference to the whole language. I did not wrote the thing myself. It is like impossible task for one person. But what I found out when I started to work on it, that most of the Ruby is already documented. So my project was to just gather it all in some logical structure, in some modern looking site. So it would look like the documentations that other languages have, that I'd like Ruby to have. But that's just one effort, just one aspect of the things, and a lot of people working on a lot of things to improving it. It's obviously it's hard to name everybody. Obviously, it's hard to name all the dozens and hundreds of people who are working on, but I'd like to some shout out at least to some of them. To the guy who maintains rubydog.org, which is just the rendering of the official docs, which is, in my opinion, like a bit better than the official rendering, which is docs.rubylang.org, and maintains it through years and makes it running. To the guy who maintains the new site rubyapi.org, it's not the reference, but it's very handy, modern, and searchable official documentation again, but it's much easier to navigate than official docs. To the guy who maintains the site documentation, documenting the situation with standard library gamification, which gems are where, how to maintain them, what are the new efforts, what are their state, and so on. To the guy who maintains very detailed reference to C API of Ruby and how to do things when you are embedding Ruby in your C program, or how to write your Ruby gems in C. And like, there are a lot of people who are really awesome, who work on different aspects, who merge new and shiny docs for standard classes. I just stumbled on Reddit on some guy who, like, 77 years old, and he loves Ruby, and he loves documentation so much that he merged, I believe, and it would be in a future version, new and very helpful and detailed docs for most of the core classes, with much more friendly explanations and detailed examples than they grew through years. So like, everybody who at least once tried to explain something about Ruby to everybody else, they are just awesome, and I urge, like, all of you to participate in this. And I especially it is especially important that I am talking not only to, like, my fellow dinosaurs, but if you are a novice, your perspective is super precious, because for guys who work with Ruby for many years, for guys who maintain Ruby, it's sometimes really hard to see which things are hard to understand, which things are explained in too technical details. So the novice's perspective, the new folks' perspective, it's precious, and it should be shared in any manner that you see suitable. Just like a ticket in official Ruby bug tracker, like saying, why is this that? I don't understand from the documentation. Cannot be explained this way. It would be helpful for all of us. So yeah, I think that this it's what I wanted to say. Let's make Ruby documented better, and let's make it prosper. Thank you.
Nice. I would say thank you very much. I think, well, you made a fantastic point. Well, of course, we have a chat. People can ask questions in there, so we're always looking there, and we are listening to the talks and thinking, well, what can we ask ourselves? And the thing is, well, it's quite clear that you have a thing with poetry, maybe already for 37 years, because, well, you're speaking, well, your verbal skills are excellent. But not only that, it's clear you've been mentoring, because the point you're raising, everybody. I mean, Phil Nash, for the talk on passwords, he was just like, yeah, I'm just nodding all the time, and that's exactly what I feel myself as well. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
And what I also think is quite interesting, you raised a point that well, you could write a blog, you could even improve your company's blog, but why don't you just improve everyone's lives? And for me, that means you're actually making sure that everyone can be helped by all the energy we as developers put in it. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
And so, yeah, I think for everyone watching now, this is the moment that you think, oh yeah, I've had that idea that I should have a blog already for the last 7 years. You're dinosaurs, like you're saying, or 12 years, like you're saying. but that we don't need that log, that we can actually make life better for everyone, especially the people beginning, even if they're beginners of 77 years old. I'd like to say thank you a lot. It was a very enlightening talk. Everyone, for everyone who this, start improving documentation for Ruby. Really. Thank you, Victor.
Thank you.